So it's with great pleasure that I welcome you to Fresno City College and introduce from Fresno County Libraries, Ms. Linda Aragon.
Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Linda Aragon, and I'm the Adults Program Librarian for the Fresno County Public Library. Tonight's program is sponsored by a grant from California Reads, which is part of the California Humanities Council's Searching for Democracy initiative. The purpose of this grant is to engage communities during this national election year and discussions about democracy through the reading of democracy-themed books. We would like to thank our partners, the Fresno City College Speakers Forum, for hosting this program and providing us with this beautiful venue, and to the Central California Asian Pacific Women for hosting the reception that will follow tonight's program. The library chose the book Farewell to Manzanar by Jeanne Wakatsuki Houston and James Houston because of its relevance to our community. Fresno has had a long history of contributions from its Japanese American citizens, mostly because of its agricultural roots and the resulting businesses that accompany it. Fresno is the location of not one, but two assembly centers for the relocation of Japanese American citizens. Part of the public library's mission is to not only promote literacy, but to help build a sense of community and cultural awareness through books and the stories they tell. Sharing stories connects us as family, friends, and community. Through the countywide reading of Farewell to Manzanar, many stories have come to light. Executive Order 9066 gave people of Japanese descent 1 week to wrap up their lives, gather their belongings, essentials, anything excluding anything metal, whatever they could carry, and report to the assembly centers. Sometimes they were in those assembly centers for 6 months because they were in such desolate areas that they had to take that long to build the roads into them. How would you deal with being given 1 week to comply to something like this? What would you take? What about your homes, your businesses, your pets, the day-to-day things that you take care of? Reading this story is creating ripples in our diverse communities. Our Hmong neighbors spent years of deprivation in refugee camps waiting to relocate. The tags with the sign numbers, such as the ones you were given tonight, that were given to Japanese Americans to wear, recall memories of the Holocaust. A woman of Armenian descent recalled growing up in Fresno and the discrimination she felt. Another woman recalled that Bank of America had an unwritten policy at the time of not hiring Armenians, a job she applied for just out of high school. This story touches many lives and people of many diverse backgrounds. Families are discussing events that took place, things that happened to neighbors, and even learning about mistakes the government made. Only in this country could this discussion be made possible. Read the book, join the discussion. It is my great pleasure this evening to introduce the woman who wrote the book that has started all these conversations. Let us please welcome Jeanne Wakatsuki Houston.
Short. Wow. Good evening, everyone. Are you? Oh, all this technology. Thank you. Thank you, Linda, for that very kind and generous introduction. It is a great pleasure for me to be here tonight And I want to thank those who have made it possible. Your librarians, Roberta Barton, Linda Aragon, and the Fresno City College Speakers Forum and Central California Asian Pacific Women. And of course, the California Council of Humanities, who created and who sponsored the Community Reads program and who selected Farewell to Manzanar as one of the books for reading. Since March of this year, I have visited more than a dozen libraries, from Mount Shasta on the Oregon border to the north, and Pacific, and Rancho Cucamonga. That's not a joke. I didn't believe it. In the South, actually, it's a very, very lovely community, quite wealthy. And I will be traveling to other libraries this fall. And it's been a truly wonderful and incredibly educating experience for me. I have learned how truly diverse in both landscape and population the state of California is. And most of all, how the libraries have become and are becoming more the vital centers for the communities to meet for all ages. I remember growing up in Long Beach, and we had a project. I lived in a housing project, and we had a project center. It was like a recreation area, and that's where everybody met to play ping pong or basketball, dances, etc. And now I see the libraries taking that role. I mean, not for dances, ping pong, but I see so many young people meeting at the library. So this is a wonderful thing. Now I'd like to thank you again, Roberta and Linda, and all the others who have worked on this project, the library, and I thank all of you for coming here tonight. And now I shall begin. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and the Hawaiian Islands on December 7, 1941, I was 7 years old. This tragic act plunged the United States into World War II. As those of you who had read the book already know, I was the youngest of 10 children, and my father was a commercial fisherman in Southern California. We lived in Santa Monica, where my father had 2 fishing boats, which he called the Golden Hind and the Neary. Now, my father was an Issei, or of the first generation, which means he was born in Japan and immigrated here to this country. He came in 1904 when he was 17 years old. So that makes him a pioneer to the West Coast. Just as some of your ancestors may have come to the East Coast of America from Europe or Africa or to California, from Mexico and Central and South America. Now, my mother was Nisei, of the second generation, an American citizen, because she was born in Hawaii, which was then a territory of the United States. That was in 1897. And as you know, Hawaii became a state in 1959. So with my father, Issei, and my mother, Nisei, my brothers and sisters and myself were somewhere between Nisei and Sansei, but we considered ourselves Sansei, third generation. Today, there are many fourth and fifth generation Japanese Americans, especially in California. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, a very unfortunate thing happened. In February of 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which ordered the relocation and internment of persons dangerous to the security of the United States. Now, this was supposed to mean anyone dangerous to America's national security. As a result of this edict, the entire Japanese American population on the West Coast was rounded up and put into 10 main camps in various remote parts of the country. This meant 122,000 individuals of Japanese descent of whom almost 70% were native-born American citizens, being born here in the United States, were uprooted from their homes and communities and removed to strange lands. Many people first were put into fairgrounds and racetracks, forced to live in horse stalls until the more permanent camps were built. Manzanar was the first permanent camp to open when our family arrived there in April 1942. Now, America was at war with Italy and Germany too, but only Japanese American families were rounded up and imprisoned in concentration camps. Now, why was this possible? How could this happen in America, land of freedom and equality? What were the factors that led to this? First was panic and fear. The bombing of Pearl Harbor, although 3,000 miles away in the Pacific, was the closest thing to invasion the United States had ever experienced. There was hysteria. And unfortunately, the newspapers and radio fed this fear with irresponsible journalism, banning hatred and irrational response with intense propaganda. Remember, there was no television in those days. There were no investigative reporters interviewing elderly women and small children filing into these desolate camps. But the press was as inflammatory as it can be today. And I put a lot of the blame of hysteria on their shoulders. The military was the first to propose removing the Japanese from the West Coast. They soon received authorization from President Roosevelt with Executive Order 9066. Even though the head of the FBI at the time, J. Edgar Hoover, claimed the Japanese were not a security threat. And in his, in his estimation, that in judgment, they were overwhelmingly loyal. Attorney General Francis Biddle also backed him up, saying it was unconstitutional. But they were overruled by the Western War Command, headed by General John DeWitt. An Executive Order 9066 was put into action, but only against the Japanese Americans. But a very powerful factor allowed this injustice to go forward and cannot be ignored. And this was racism. Since the Chinese immigrants first arrived in the 1840s to work in the mines and for the railroad, there had been intense anti-Asian feelings on the West Coast. This was more than 100 years ago. At that time in California, there was a great labor shortage. Remember that? It's a lot about labor. Where do we get our labor? And big companies looked to the east for workers. Where do we look now? The first Asian arrivals were often seen as threatening simply because they looked different, were strangers, and spoke a different language. Soon, after building railroads and providing back-breaking labor for the development of the West Coast, they saved their money and began having businesses and buying land. They became economic competitors. This economic threat spurred legislation to prevent Asians from owning land, and this is how it was accomplished. First, in 1911, a law was passed which prevented aliens or non-American citizens of Asian background from becoming citizens. Then 2 years later, in 1913, another law was passed denying ownership of land to non-citizens. Thus, my father, who came to this country in 1904, who contributed to its growth as a pioneer, could not become a citizen nor own land until 1952, when the Walter McCarran Immigration and Nationality Act allowed him the right to naturalize. and that was the year I graduated from high school. Despite these racially imposed barriers, many families prospered. The Japanese were very successful farmers and fishermen, and by 1941, they controlled 40% of the truck farming business in California. But with the forced internment, most of these families lost their properties and businesses and dropped out of American society for an average of 3 years. Actually longer, because after the war was over and the camps closed, most preferred to slip back into their communities unnoticed. Still reeling from the massive displacement, there was fear of further racism, rumors of lynchings, house burnings, and violence had swept through the camps. Excuse me, jobs and housing were scarce, and the majority was at economic zero. Everyone had to work very hard just to survive and recover economically. And of course, many families never did recover their losses. Most of the public were unaware of the 100th Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the Nisei fighting unit that fought so valiantly in Europe, earning more Purple Hearts and medals than any other military group of its size. They were young Japanese-American soldiers, some volunteers from Hawaii, and others drafted out of the camps. Some who proved their loyalty by sacrificing their lives. 35,000 Japanese American men and women served in the armed forces during World War II. 2,500 in the Pacific Theater as military intelligence soldiers, my brother among them. Called MacArthur's secret weapon, their intelligence work is purported to have shortened the war in the Pacific by a year. Still for many, the recovery period after the war was very harsh, with survival from day to day the only goal. Now, World War II took place more than 70 years ago, 1941 to 1945. Farewell to Manzanar was written 30 years later, and since its publication in 1973, I have spoken to many, many groups about the internment experience, and always two questions are asked. One, why did it take so long to tell my story? Why 30 years after the event? And two, do I think it can ever happen again in America? For many years, Manzanar remained a dim memory, something the family rarely talked about. I used to think I dreamt those years in Japan, and it wasn't until almost 30 years later that I revived those dreams and collaborated with my husband to write about them. In 1971, my nephew, who was attending UC Berkeley, came to visit in Santa Cruz. And for those of you who read the book, he was the young boy who was born in camp just 2 days after Christmas. And he was taking a sociology class, and for the first time in his life, outside of talking family, had heard the word Manzanar. Auntie, he said, you know, I was born in Manzanar, and I don't know anything about that place. Can you tell me something about it? His professor had pointed out the existence of camps, but that was all. Until then, Manzanar had seemed more a family myth than an actual fact to my nephew. Sure, I said, but why don't you ask your folks? I have, but they seem reluctant, like I shouldn't be asking, or there's some skeleton in the closet I'm not supposed to know about. Now that's strange, I thought. Whenever our family talked about camp, which wasn't often, we joked about things such as the lousy food the dust storms, the communal showers. We talked lightheartedly about the outdoor movies, the baseball games, and the schools. So I proceeded to tell the same stories in the same superficial way as if I was sharing some summer camp experience. My nephew looked at me intently, very quiet, and then said, "Auntie, that's bizarre. You were locked up in prison. How did you feel about that?" For a moment, I was stunned. He asked a question no one had ever asked before, a question I had never dared to ask myself. How did I feel? And for the first time in my life, I dropped the cover of humor and nonchalance, and I allowed myself to feel. And I began to cry, and I couldn't stop. My poor nephew was upset. What had he done to send his auntie into such hysterics? I realized then why his parents were unable to tell him about Manzanar. At the time, I was auntie to 33 nieces and nephews. 7 had been born in camp, and I was certain none knew about the birthplace. I decided to write a memoir, a history, just for our family. But I found that whenever I tried to write, whenever I would go down to the beach and sit and try to remember, that I would just break down and cry. So I turned to my husband, a writer and teacher at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and told him of my problem. "What memoir?" he asked. Now, Jim and I had been married 14 years at that time, and I had known him for 5 years before we married. And I had never told him about Manzanar. He knew of some, quote, camp in my background, but I had never revealed any true feelings. And when I did, he said, "This is not a story just for your family. It's a story everyone in America should know. Let's work on this together." Thus began a collaboration that lasted for a year. I talked for hours into a tape recorder, and we interviewed family and other internees willing to talk about the event, and we researched the library. The months spent delving into those 3 years of my childhood and its aftermath was as powerfully therapeutic as years as a psychiatrist, and a lot cheaper. We found there were already 40 books written on the internment, but they were mostly academic and political. We found no personal stories from internees themselves that addressed the emotional and psychological damage of the experience. Not only was there the cultural attitude, shikatakanai, it's over and can't be helped. The phenomenon of post-traumatic stress syndrome, unknown 30 years ago, had silenced most internees. Today, we know how the experience of death, of divorce, sexual abuse, and parental alcoholism can remain buried in the subconscious until the memory resurfaces years later, and it usually takes 20 or 30 years. For many internees, the original shocks of the loss, family upheaval, and quote, guilt were suppressed for many years. I realized the feeling I carried about the incarceration was one of deep humiliation, like a person who had been raped. You are the victim, yet you are sullied by the experience, ashamed to draw attention to it. For years, I felt guilty for the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Somehow, I must have been responsible for that infamous event. When I asked my mother, this was in camp, why are we in this prison? I was then too young to understand war and politics, and she said, it's because we are Japanese. She didn't say anything about a war with Japan. So in my childish mind, it was not only bad to be Japanese, it was criminal. Feeling guilty for the bombing of Pearl Harbor is similar to the feeling many Americans have for the atomic blast over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those crimes of a government can become sins of the people, and especially in the mind of an innocent child. Like the Vietnam vets, it took from 20 to 30 years for the defenses to wear down. The time had come for a communal catharsis, a healing for the Japanese American community, and also for the United States. Spurred by diligent Renaissance lawyers, the struggle for justice culminated in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which apologized for the government's actions and offered monetary compensation to survivors of the camp. This victory was not for Japanese Americans alone. It was a great victory for all Americans, because the internment was an important American issue, not just a Japanese American one. For the first time in the history of this country, in 1942, all three branches of our government violated the Constitution, the highest law of the land. The Civil Liberties Act proved our Constitution is not just a piece of parchment under glass in the National Archives. It is a living, vital contract that binds us all together as Americans. And if that contract is broken, as in 1942, it is not just the rights of individuals that are threatened, but the very fabric of this democratic nation. Today, there are all too many politicians and irresponsible media who find scapegoats to blame for the country's problems. And more, it seems, those scapegoats are immigrants. How often do we hear, they are different from us, have no idea of democracy and freedom. They won't speak our language. How many of us who lived through the racism and incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II remember what it was like to have those very words directed against one innocent group. But today, we should know better. We have the shoulders of Martin Luther King and others to stand upon. Our consciousness has changed, and because of this, our task is greater. We are in a partnership, a complex relationship where we must learn about each other. No longer do we live in the simplistic structure of one group authoritatively dominating others. And so with those words, I'll now stop with that part of my presentation. I thought I would read a few pages from the book. And a few pages will be about when we leave camp. I don't know how many of you read this, but it's about, it's not very long, it's about how my father decided that we were going to leave camp. Manzanar, the war was over, we had to leave. And most people went on buses. It was late afternoon when we heard the horn, still blocks away. Without looking out the door, Mama said, "Here he comes." As the honks came closer, we heard another sound like a boxer working out a flabby punching bag. Mama moved to the doorway. We all did. Cheeses, me, in time to see a blue Nash four-door come around the corner with its two front tires flat, and Papa sitting up straight and proud behind the wheel, his hat cocked, his free hand punching at the horn. He stopped in front, racing the engine and grinning while he eyed Mama and fingered the shiny knob's dashboard gear shift. And, gear shift was actually in the dashboard. On the seat between his legs, he held a half-empty quart bottle of whiskey. He yelled, "What do you think, little Mama?" She didn't answer. He had not been drinking much at all for about 6 months. She stood there, waiting to see what he was going to do. He laughed and made the engine roar and demanded to know where all his boys were. He wanted to He wanted to show those yogures what a real car looked like. Teal was the only son still in camp, and he had gone off to help someone else load furniture. So Papa announced that he would give all his women a ride. Mama protested, said he had to get those tires fixed if he was expected to take this car all the way into Los Angeles. Papa roared back at her, louder than the engine, with such a terrible samurai scowl that we all went leaping and hiding into the car. Mama laughed, slamming the back door and climbing into the front seat next to him. "You think it's a pretty good car?" he said, pleased by this show of power. Mama said nothing. She sat very stiff, cool, enduring him. Chizu was the placater now. Chizu was my sister-in-law, leaning forward from the back to pat him on the shoulder. "It's a fine car, Papa. You watch." He grabbed the gear lever and rammed it into the Nash leaped, and we were cloppeting down the street on those two flats and two good tires, and Papa laughing, sipping from the bottle. At the first corner, he said, this is in camp. This was before we left camp. At the first corner, he said, "You think I can't pick out cars?" Softly, Chizu said, "You did real good, Papa." He stepped on the gas, hitting maybe 30, swerving crazily. In the back seat, we were all thrown around, flung from door to door like rag dolls, with Mama bouncing in front of us and Papa's hat crunching up against the ceiling. Maid cried out, "Not so fast, Papa. You're going to wreck your car." "Think this car can't take it?" he yelled back. "You watch this." His gaiety turned ferocious again. He stomped the pedal, pushing the speedometer up to 35. His right front tire had shredded, and it flopped like a mangled arm. It lashed out, upending a garbage can. I started to cry. Chizu, her calm shattered, was yelling at him to slow it down. Mama was too, and May was screaming. These are all the girls that he made get into the car. He wouldn't listen and told us to hold on while he swung into the street, careening past empty barracks where suitcases and duffel bags sat stacked. As we passed people standing by the baggage, Papa swerved from one side to the other, waving. He laughed, growled, making faces. In front of us, a family was hiking out toward the main gate. Papa swung wide, honking and waving. "Hey, hey," he shouted. They turned, too amazed to wave back. "Don't miss that bus," he yelled. At the next corner, he spun off into a deserted section of barracks. Those already looked like the ones we first moved into. Sand piling up against foundation blocks, the clotheslines empty, all signs and markers gone. It made no difference to Papa that no one was out there to witness his performance. He aimed for tumbleweeds lying in the roadbed and shouted with triumph each time he squashed one. Chizu and Mama and May had quit trying to control him. I'd stopped crying. We grabbed for handholds, covered our heads, hoping simply to survive until he hit something hard or ran out of gas. We came to a fire break, and Papa plunged into it, began to cut a twisty path across its emptiness, shouting, "Yeah, yeah," gouging ragged tracks through the dusty sand. The way this fire break lay, there seemed to be nothing in front of us now but sagebrush and open country, rising in the distance south of camp to the range of round, buff-colored hills, rumored to be full of rattlesnakes. The few times I wish I could walk in one direction for as long as I wanted, the threat of those rattlesnakes deterred me. And now further south, beyond that visible barrier, out in the world, I scarcely remembered, there loomed the dark, threatening cloud I'd heard grown-ups talk about. The way we seemed to be heading. I should have been frightened into a coma, but for this once, I was not. Watching Papa bounce and weave and shout in front of me, I was almost ready to laugh with him, with the first bubbly sense of liberation his defiant craziness had brought along with it. I believed in him completely just then, believed in the fierceness flashing in his wild eyes. Somehow, that would get us past whatever waited. excuse me, inside the fearful dark cloud. Get us back the heat and the rabbits and a great deal more. Excuse me, I think I'm amazing this. At the fence, he had to turn, sending up a white bill of dust. Where the fence met the highway, we cornered again, heading for the bus stop. A crowd waited there, standing idly, sitting around on scattered baggage. They all turned to watch when they heard us coming. Papa tooted the horn and yelled out, "No bus for us! No bus for us!" The young kids were mystified by this and stood open-eyed, watching. Some of the older folks smiled, waving as we hit a chuckle and bounced. Papa swung left, and we clattered out into the wide, empty boulevard that ran the length of the camp, back to where our luggage waited and the final packing. So if you do, and I will repeat your question.
I just want to say thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I saw somebody, yes, thank you. Oh my God, yes, I was just talking about Ralph Lazo. Why, are you related to him? Oh. Yeah, Ralph Lazo was, I think he was Latino. Was he Latino? And he lived in Los Angeles. And his best friends were Japanese Americans. Yeah. So when they had to leave for Manzanar, he decided to go with the family. So Ralph Lazo, he was one of the most popular persons in camp. He was always, he came to camp and he stayed. He lived with the Japanese family there for 2.5, 3 years. He was president of the senior class. He was a Yale leader. He was so popular. And if you see any of the Manzanar annuals of the high school, he's in there predominantly. And actually, I mean, I'm so sorry. I mean, I think he has since passed away. But I felt like there was a great movie about this man. Maybe there can be one if someone can do some research about his life and his purpose and his reason and what happened after he came back. But thank you for mentioning that. There was a lot of crazy things that went on.
There is a movie on it.
There is one. Is there a documentary? What is it called? The Ralph Lazo story? Thank you. There is a documentary called The Ralph Lazo Story. I'd like to see it myself. I didn't know it had been done. It's a very poignant story.
Yeah. Do you remember what kind of guard you had at the camp? Were they military or
Yes.
civilian?
No, they were military. In the first year, I would say the first year, maybe the first year and a half when we first went, it was like it was run by the military. It was run by the, well, just by the military, and then it switched over to the, oh, I forgot the name of it, but somebody remember what the name of the organization or government, it was a government part of agency that took over, that takes over the Native Americans. Yes, or one of those, but anyway, when the military had control the first year, there were guards at every, corner, and probably more than every corner of the camp, which was a mile square. And they were soldiers that guarded from there. And they had searchlights at night. I mean, it was very intense when we first went into camp. Then they realized, that it was insane, so they just stopped the military pulled out. And then the civilian government agency took over. So there was at first, and there were in some camps, I mean, this was in all the camps, you know, of which there were 10, that in one camp there actually was a shooting of a young guy, young boy, I don't know if he's a young teenager, who had gone outside the barbed wire to collect firewood, and he was shot. Not killed, but he was shot by a guard. So, yes, it was pretty intense.
You said that you could ask repeatedly whether you think this could happen again.
It can. I believe that anything can happen again if we don't know about it and we don't see the dangerous signs of what is happening. You know, and it is about when we start dehumanizing a group, or you know, saying that that they are dangerous to us. You know, for instance, after 9/11, or that for the Muslim population in the country, I mean, it was very scary for them. And they even contacted the JSL to say, how can we be helped about this, because this fear can do that, and then we stop thinking about, who we are as Americans. We have to remember, I mean, I'm looking in this audience here, there are so many different races, and I'm sure immigrant groups represented, that if one is attacked for any reason, it could mean that another group could be attacked. We have to protect each other, because it's difficult. We are probably one of the only countries in the world that is a constitutional democracy and has been populated by immigrants. Australia has a lot of immigrants, but they are not a democracy. They're not a democracy like we are. Yeah.
What was a normal day in family life? What was the routine of your family?
Okay. I mean, I'm sure it'd be different for different families, but the actual schedule that was put on, to the populace was that we had a restaurant, mess hall, for each block. So there were, let's say, 36 blocks, and there were 13 barracks in each block. And each block had a mess hall. So people in that, those barracks there would eat at that mess hall, and the meals would be served maybe, 7, 12, 5 or 6, something like that. So it was very much like a military camp base. In fact, when we first went there, we didn't have any warm clothes, because so many of us came from Los Angeles. And, the Mojave Desert can be very cold in the wintertime. So we didn't have warm clothes. So what they did was the Army brought in, or whoever was running the camp, brought in World War I uniforms, old World War I, and so we had to convert those into, because they're wool, very heavy wool, convert those into jackets and capes and so forth. Yes.
After hearing about your Woodruff, after you came back from Japan,
Yes.
did you ever attempt to go to Japan?
Did you
Ever attempted to go to Japan?
I have been to Japan. I went there on a fellowship, but this was in 1990 sometime for information writing of my novel Firehouse Woman. And but I didn't go to Hiroshima. I went past it, but you see, it was totally destroyed. And there was something about I couldn't go back because my whole family's history has been hit. It's gone from there. So I was in Fukuoka, which is down in Kyushu.
What advice might you offer us? Your family, your experiences you've gone through. Many of these folks probably in this room have had things happen to them that were unrighteous, that they were mistreated, that they've been misled, and all those kinds of words. What would you want to teach us, suggest to us, offer to us? How might we live despite the things that have happened to us? How might we go forward?
Well, for one, be sure that you're in contact with a group like the Japanese American Citizens League. There may be other groups that, what is it for the Latinos? Is it political groups or even cultural groups who, you can speak to. And also just realize that you have rights as an individual. Write to your congressman or, teach it in your classes, talk to your teachers. I mean, it's very important to realize what America really means. What it means as an experience and actually as an experiment. In fact, my husband and I traveled to Asia and Southeast Asia. We showed our films there on Manzanar and spoke to different groups. And it was very interesting. We were in Korea. We showed the film and I spoke, and there was a man there, I think he was a scholar. And he said, I'm not impressed at all by your camps. He says, your camps are like summer camps compared to the camps that we have in Korea, where people are killed, etc., etc. He said, but what really just impresses me almost to tears, he says, is that your government allows you to come to another country, allows you to talk about a terrible mistake that they made, but rectify it. So, it's a real lesson in democracy. It was a violation of democracy, but it was rectified. I mean, of course, it took some years, but it was. And that is something, that is very different in other countries. And this is what this Korean gentleman said. He was so impressed with that. So,
in your years of research, did you find it difficult to find others willing to talk about their experience?
yes.
Why do you think
See, this was quite a while back. This was in, the early 70s. So, because, one, there's a lot of shame involved with that. It's like being raped. Until you really, get into it, about the experience. But it's like, oh, don't bring up bad things. Just forget about it. Just, go forward with it. So there were, a lot of people didn't want to talk about it, even in my own family. But I think we've gone past that. Because we have to talk about it, we have to acknowledge it, and not only what happened to Japanese Americans, but it happens to any group, that this is how we can keep America really free and democratic. Yes, 10,000. There are 10,000 in each camp, in a mile square, approximately. Tule Lake had 16, and I think Hart Mountain had 16. So they were big camps. Yeah, Poston had how many camps? 3 camps. Oh, would somebody share that about Poston? Because I don't know much about Poston. They obliterated Poston, right? There's nothing there that even, and there are incredible stories about Poston. Were you there? Do you want to share something about that? You said there were 3 camps? So how many people did that mean? 17,000. This was in Poston, Arizona. And today, there are no barracks left. Is there a memorial?
We just moved, I remember the Postal Restoration Project, we just moved there, Lieutenant Parker moved it back to the Postal site. There's still the elementary school is there out of Postal.
I think it's so important for Arizona to know this, because they're having so many problems with immigrants and all about the laws about Latinos coming over and so forth, that they need to know about this happening in their own state. And it's kind of I mean, Arizona's an interesting state, right? Because there's a lot of retired people over there. Yeah, so they're like California, with people from other places. But you know, idealism doesn't end after 60. Idealism, that's when you can really, you know, we have to do that. We have to think about ideals, what makes human beings more than just the, you know, physical beings, right? It has to be about our ideals and our spirit and about wanting to do good for each other. He's asking if during the time of Manzanar there was resistance to revolt. Oh yes, there was a huge riot the first year around Christmas time. Yes, there was, and there were also, yes, there were a lot of upheavals because going to the camp, no one knew where we were going or what it was going to be like. And then once we got there, it's like, oh my God, this is what we're going to be? How do we govern ourselves? And you know, and so forth. So, yes, and you know, when you know that scientifically, if you enclose or, you know, encage people within a certain area, that there's going to be a lot of anger and a lot of fighting that comes up. So there was, yes. Oh, sure, there was a huge riot. I remember a big riot in camp, and there were some boys shot. But then, you know, my family noticed to get in the barracks, get in the barracks, you know, they just ran wild. It was like a riot. And it was over somebody being, it started over somebody being in prison, they said, unlawfully. That he was being blamed for sugar being stolen. And it was actually sugar that was being stolen by the soldiers, you know, because they were selling it on the black market. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Let's speak loud.
In your book, you said that sugar was stolen by the chief steward in the kitchen.
That's right.
Was that chief steward named Joe Winchester?
Was that what?
Was that chief steward named Joe Winchester?
Joe Winchester.
Was he named Joe Winchester?
Oh, was he named Joe Winchester? Gosh, I don't know. That's something that's for someone to investigate and research. I don't know who the names of these people were. I mean, they're just memories for everybody. That, you know, unless you were really right involved, you know. We changed it for the movies, for sure.
On the movie, I just want to ask about the original production, who financed it?
Oh, okay.
And how you got those Japanese actors?
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you for your question, because there's lots of goody stuff about the movie. Well, as soon as the book came out, we sent it to John Cordy. You know, he's a great filmmaker, and he had just won about 11 Emmys for the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. So, and we knew that he was, you know, he was a great filmmaker, and he probably would be very interested in this. So we sent him a book, and apparently a dozen other people sent him the book. One night, my husband and I got out to dinner, and our son Joshua was home, and so we came home, and our son says, "Oh, somebody called up." He said, "Oh, did he leave his name?" And he said, "No." He said he said his name was John Cordy. And I said, "Oh, well, what did he call about?" He said that you would know. And so that's how the film, you know, film idea got started. And yes, it was a very difficult film to do, because at that time in Hollywood, they were very ignorant, you know, we went down and they said, "Oh, you know, this is a Universal Studios or someplace." They had somebody, some Cassie in front say, oh, well, who are the Japanese, I mean, who are the Asian actors? We don't have any American actors who speak Japanese. He said, this film is not going to be in Japanese. He said, are we going to get Toshiro Mifune? You know, it was just insane. And so we said, no, and we realized that they didn't understand the issue at all. They did not understand. So John said, we cannot make this film in Hollywood. So we're going to have to make this film outside, you know, like up north or someplace. Because if they have control, it would just be terrible. So we had a great ally at Universal Studios named Frank Price at the time, and I forgot who the great producer was, George Santoro, and they just gave John the go-ahead. So that's how John went ahead with it and got, you know, Asian American actors. It was the first film to use Asian American actors in the lead roles. And yeah, we went to Manzanar film, we went to Tulare, and we had the extras were actually people who had been interned and who came back to play their parents. You know? Pat Morita was in it, because he had been in Tulare. So it was a very, very moving experience, because we didn't film at Manzanar, we filmed at Tulare. Thank you for that question. I'm going to have to give someone else a chance, okay? Yeah? Yes?
I just wanted to tell you, thank you for bringing up the Constitution.
Oh, no. Who are you? I think we got Miss. Okay, and then it'll be you in the blue shirt and the glasses. Okay, who's up there?
I just wanted to tell you, I'm mixed for 3 different nationalities. Thank you for bringing up the Constitution of the United States. We're all should be protected by Benjamin Franklin, and all of our forefathers who claim, you know, my father went to World War II, but when he came home, he let that go. We shouldn't bring things with us as baggage for racism, but I see it all the time in this town.
I'm so sorry, I don't know. Can you hear her? No.
I'm sorry. I just want to tell you thank you for bringing up the Constitution of the United States, because by the Constitution, which we're supposed to be following, none of us are supposed to be judged upon our looks, more by what we achieve and how we set out to do.
That's right. In other words, they're saying, thank you for mentioning the Constitution of the United States, because you feel that we are not following it. No, or that we are not being aware. You know, I understand what you're saying.
We don't really understand our rights as human beings. We're not animals anymore. We're to be treated as such. And, you know, being mixed, you know, occasionally I hear wet that mentioned in the back of my head, you know, things like that. But they're not seeing the whole picture, because everyone can contribute something to a society.
That's right.
And it doesn't matter, you know, good or bad, still, you know, they can contribute. You know, so thank you.
Thank you.
How was life like for the Japanese Americans after the camp? I would imagine it was pretty hard.
It was. I think a lot of Japanese Americans will say it was the worst. That was the hardest time, was getting out of camp, because we were at economic zero. Couldn't get jobs, couldn't, you know, so I think it was a very difficult time, because so many people lost their homes, their land. My father was a fisherman, he had 2 fishing boats. He couldn't even fish after that when he came back from North Dakota, where they put him, because, you know, he was considered an alien. They didn't let him fish. So it was very difficult, I think, the post-war years for many Japanese Americans, and I think that there's been a lot written about that.
As a retired elementary teacher, how was the transition for you from camp to public school?
Well, it was, you know, that's what I get into in Farewell to Manzanar, because I really realized, oh, I have to be an American, a super American. You know, and I love Doris Day and so forth, and I wish I had blonde hair, and, because everybody else had blonde hair and blue eyes who were majorettes and so forth. So it affected me that way of wanting to belong, wanting to be a part of my young society. And because at that time, you know, we didn't have pride in our ethnic minorities. It was about being an American, and to be an American meant someone from Anglo-Saxon background, you know, blonde hair and so forth. I mean, that makes it sound crazy to you people here and say, ooh, wow, that was so honest. But that's how it was when I was a young teenager and wanting to belong. And to be, I mean, what is it today? Someone share, what is it today that young teenagers feel how they want to belong?
They text.
Oh.
This is the natural time to ask for maybe 2 or 3 more questions.
Okay.
To wrap it up, we do have a
Hey,
reception.
look, we have back there, we have students, I think. Okay, the back row, we get one question. Okay, stand up and say it loud.
In your opinion, the government took utility more of a military necessity rather than a racial problem?
Well, that's what the government said, but we know it was racist. Yes, that's what the government said, but we know it was racist because there was ignorance. Ignorance abounded then. You know, today, you know, we're way ahead of the game. We're way ahead of the game. And God bless us for it.
Thank you.
Did you think that there's refreshments?
So at this time, we'd like to once again thank Jeanne for coming out and sharing with us this evening.